Well, I am so excited once again to introduce Dr. Stephanie Seneff, who is joining us all the way from Hawaii. So it's early in the morning for her. And actually, this is our third time to have Dr. Seneff speak on our Global Glyphosate Summit. If you have joined us before, you will have heard Dr. Seneff revealing the depth of glyphosate's impact on our genes, specifically our glycine molecule, which is very eye-opening. The depth of knowledge based on her own research is absolutely second to none. She is regarded by her peers and many others as the world's foremost authority on glyphosate. Dr. Seneff is an MIT professor and author of Toxic Legacy. I highly recommend this. You can find many of Dr. Seneff's talks and interviews on YouTube and other platforms, which I highly recommend. And thanks to Dr. Seneff, we don't have to be the experts. We just connect people to the experts. And I am thrilled to turn over to Dr. Seneff now to share with us how glyphosate is impacting our ecosystem. Over to you, Dr. Seneff.
Lovely introduction. Thank you so much for that lovely introduction. Sorry, I think I was muted there. So I'm thrilled to be here. Thank you for having me. And my topic today is actually different from what I usually talk about with glyphosate, as you know. So I'm focusing on the ecosystem. As I've done many talks and papers around glyphosate's toxicity to humans and all the different health effects that it has, which are legion. I mean, as you said, glycine, it substitutes for glycine during protein synthesis. I believe that's true, even though I'm getting some pushback from the industry. But I think I should just go right to my slides. I have a set of slides that I've prepared, and so I will share my screen. Okay, you all can see this? Oops.
Yes, we can. Yes, we can, Stephanie.
Great. Okay, so here's my title, Glyphosate and the Ecosystem. I always like to start my talks off with a quote. If you think the economy is more important than the environment, try holding your breath while counting your money. And I just kind of like that quote. So here's where we're going. I have an introduction, and then I'm going to talk about red tide in Florida and the algae bloom issues, both in Florida and, of course, around the Great Lakes. There's a lot of issues with algae blooms that I think are being, glyphosate's a major contributor to that. I'm going to speak about how glyphosate disrupts both nitrogen and carbon fixation, and that actually connects a lot to the issues with high levels of greenhouse gases. And then finally, cloud seeding. This is something that I newly discovered within the last couple of months. Very fascinating science around these phytoplankton that are able to create clouds over the ocean, over the shallow seas, and they're being killed by glyphosate. So I have a feeling that's affecting the cloud cover over the oceans, which is causing the oceans to heat up. So first, an introduction, a brief history of glyphosate. It's now the #1 herbicide in use, both in the US and throughout the world. It was patented by Monsanto as an herbicide in 1969. So it's been around for a very long time. We started getting poisoned by it in 1974. They started using it to control weeds in the environment. It came out from under patent in 2000. And it inhibits an enzyme, the shikimate pathway, involved in the synthesis of tryptophan, tyrosine, and phenylalanine, which are the 3 aromatic amino acids. And there was a huge expansion of GMO, corn, soy, cotton, and canola crops in the late 1990s, which has led to sharp increases in the use of glyphosate over the past 2 years, and that 2 decades. And that really has a lot to do with the increased resistance of the weeds. As they used glyphosate on these GMO crops, many of the weeds evolved to be resistant, so they had to use more. And that's why it kept the usage here kept going up over time as the weeds became resistant. And now we're kind of in a crisis where glyphosate is simply not working on certain very resistant weeds, and they're having to introduce other chemicals besides glyphosate into the formulations to control those resistant weeds. This is my book. You saw her holding it up, released by Chelsea Green in 2021, and it has a huge list of references in the back. Hundreds of references in the back. It presents extensive data on glyphosate toxicity to both animals and humans. And it shows how glyphosate interferes with sulfate homeostasis. And I think that is a critical factor in autism. And I believe glyphosate is the #1 cause of the autism epidemic that we're seeing in the United States today. And the book argues that glyphosate is insidiously, cumulatively toxic through its diabolical insertion into proteins by mistake in place of the coding amino acid glycine. This is a central theme of the book, and also a central theme of my presentations on glyphosate. We'll get to that more here in a moment. This unique feature explains why it is causal in so many diseases. And the book was selected by Kirkus Reviews as one of the top 100 nonfiction books of 2021. So here's the big picture. Glyphosate disrupts many aspects of metabolism in plants, animals, microbes, and fungi. Increased use of fertilizers compensates for inefficient utilization of nitrogen and phosphorus. And then you have nitrate and phosphate runoff into the waterways, which then introduces, and it causes a lot of disruption of the ecosystem in the waterways. Nitrous oxide, which comes from the nitrate spill off, is a potent greenhouse gas, much more potent than carbon dioxide, and it's induced by glyphosate. Glyphosate interferes with the capture of carbon in the plants and then in the soil, and certain marine phytoplankton can seed cloud formation over oceans, but glyphosate suppresses their growth. And I think that may be a critical issue in the warming of the oceans, which is messing up the coral reefs. So this was a lovely paper. I was quite struck by this paper showing that glyphosate accumulates in biofilms. So glyphosate polluting waterways, glyphosate is polluting the waterways, for example, in Florida. And so what they did in this experiment was they had some water that was murky, had a lot of biomass in it, and they added glyphosate to it, and then they measured how much glyphosate was in the water after a period of time. And what they found was the glyphosate disappeared rapidly. And then it was like, where did it go? It wasn't that it got metabolized by the microbes, it was that it got sucked up by the biofilms. So the biofilms actually had 2 to 4 orders of magnitude higher levels of glyphosate than the surrounding water. And I think this is what's impacting the manatees in Florida, making them sick because they're eating that biomass. And so they're getting a huge concentration of glyphosate in their diet. So it appears to rapidly disappear, but that's an illusion. And then there are all these important bottom of the food chain animals that live in those biofilms that are also getting heavily exposed to the glyphosate. So a quote from that paper, we may be under-recognizing the potential ecological risk of contaminants like glyphosate that are concentrating in biofilms and subsequently being consumed and going up the food chain. So water fleas are a very low-level animal in the food chain, so they're very important too because animals eat those and animals eat the animals that eat those, et cetera. They're near the bottom of the aquatic food chain. All these other animals, tadpoles, salamanders, newts, aquatic insects, and many types of small fish feed on the water fleas. So they did an experiment exposing water fleas to low-dose concentrations of Roundup and glyphosate, well below the approved regulatory threshold. And then they looked at their health, and they found many problems: embryonic developmental failure, systemic inflammation, degradation of the collagen matrix, impaired wound healing, disrupted gut microbes. And so the animals that eat the water fleas pick up the glyphosate, and then they get sick, and it goes up the food chain. So here's my next section: red tide and algae blooms. So this was an article: Is agriculture's use of glyphosate feeding Lake O's explosive algae blooms? That's Lake Okeechobee in Florida, where there's sugarcane agriculture all around the lake. And then glyphosate is also used in the waterways. They have some invasive weeds in the waterways, and they actually put glyphosate into the water. There's also, of course, the lovely homes in Florida that use glyphosate on their beautiful lawns, and that's also washing off into the waterways. So the waterways in Florida have high levels of glyphosate in them. And these microbes, cyanobacteria, can break down the CP bond in glyphosate. Glyphosate has this rather unique CP bond that stumps most animal species, including microbes. But these cyanobacteria are very good at breaking that bond. They can utilize the phosphorus that's released as a nutrient for them, and then they can explosively grow. The cyanobacteria go out of control because they're actually doing a good service, which is to break down the glyphosate. And so chronic exposure to glyphosate in Florida manatee, article here, published in 2021. Manatees are getting very sick. Every year they're getting worse. This year it's even worse than last year. Their populations are being decimated, and they look like they're kind of dying of starvation. So glyphosate is ubiquitous in the waterways in Florida. And then, of course, the sugarcane harvest was introducing higher concentrations. They observed that in this study. Those manatees have increased body burdens since 2009. Their body burdens are going up every year since 2009 when they measure the level of glyphosate in manatees. And then they're sick and starving due to loss of seagrass, and the seagrass is where the glyphosate is being sucked up because of that issue of the biomass. So the cyanobacteria feed the red tide. So we have a huge problem with the red tide around the Florida coastal areas. And also the inland blue-green algae around Great Lakes, for example. Well, this is South Florida. This is talking specifically about South Florida during the summer, killing vast numbers of fish and other wildlife, including dozens of dolphins, manatees, sea turtles, sharks, and eels. So the cyanobacteria actually feed off of the glyphosate. They love it because it's got both phosphorus and nitrogen. It's everything they need to grow. And then the red tide algae flourish because the cyanobacteria are able to supply them with the nitrates that they need to flourish. And so this is a whole food chain that works well because the glyphosate is fueling the growth of the cyanobacteria, and that causes the red tide, which makes the seafood inedible. So Zen Honeycutt is a friend of mine, a dear friend of mine. She's a founder of Moms Across America, and Moms Across America did a study on lots of things, including the Florida orange juice, which she found lots of glyphosate in Florida orange juice, which of course is also being exposed to the glyphosate that's being heavily used in Florida for all the reasons that I've discussed. So she took a water sample from the coast of Cape Coral at the mouth of the Caloosahatchee River, and there were cyanobacteria growing there. And then she measured the glyphosate levels and got back this result. Your level is that what she found in her sample. This is a sample from Sacramento municipal drinking water, so they had contamination, but much, much less. This is the maximum amount allowed by Europe. So even this sample exceeded the maximum. This one far exceeded the maximum amount of glyphosate allowed in Europe, in water in Europe. Okay, next topic, disrupted nitrogen and carbon fixation. Agricultural runoff contributes to climate change, was an article that was published here. New.NSF, from the NSF. So nitrous oxide is a potent greenhouse gas. Its warming potential is 300 times that of carbon dioxide. So we talk a lot about carbon dioxide, but we really should be looking at nitrous oxide. And then the fertilizer runoff in the farm fields increases the load of nitrogen washing into the rivers and streams. And there, the nitrogen breathing back microbes can break down the fertilizer into nitrous oxide, and that's released into the atmosphere. That's a gas. And so what happens is that the nitrates that come down get reduced to nitrous oxide, get released as a gas, and contribute in a major way to global warming. So how glyphosate can disrupt nitrogen fixation in plants, I have 3 references here. Mung beans, a study on mung beans exposed to glyphosate showed that they had impaired nitrogen uptake. So glyphosate is messing up the uptake of nitrogen into plants. And that's critically dependent on nitrogen fixing bacteria. And they use an enzyme called nitrogenase to convert nitrogen to ammonia, which makes it accessible to the plants. So glyphosate exposure at sublethal levels severely impairs nitrogenase activity in these microbes. And it also inhibits phosphoenolpyruvate carboxylase. This is a very important enzyme in plants, and I'll have more to say about it in a moment, but that is also important for the incorporation of both carbon and nitrogen into plants. So for all of these reasons, you can expect more nitrous oxide being released from the waterways because of the runoff from the crops, because the crops aren't taking it up. So PEPEC is a very interesting enzyme. It's a ubiquitous enzyme in plants. It's also present in archaea, cyanobacteria, and green algae. And it's an integral enzyme in photosynthesis to assimilate carbon dioxide into green plants. So that's super important. It's an important enzyme for photosynthesis. So it has a terminal sequence. This is getting into some technical details. QNTG, this G is glycine. So these are amino acids, a sequence of 4 amino acids. The last amino acid in that molecule is the glycine. And it's highly conserved across multiple phyla. So all these different species of animals in the animal kingdom have, and in the microbes have glycine at the end of that. I'm sorry, not in the animal kingdom, plant kingdom and microbes have that G at the end. Glyphosate was shown experimentally to suppress the activity of this in a study here, which was published in 2006. And replacement of the terminal glycine with the negatively charged amino acid aspartate causes up to 1,000-fold decrease in its activity. And this is super important because I always use aspartate and glutamate as a model for glyphosate. And I talk about that in my book because those two are very similar to glyphosate in their physical and chemical properties because they're bulkier, much bulkier than glycine, and they have a negative charge, just like glyphosate. So they're a good model. So I know if aspartate is substituting, then when glyphosate substitutes, you'll have the same effect, 1,000-fold decrease. So this is just a paper that shows all these different species here of microbes and whatnot that have this different versions of this enzyme, and they all have this glycine at the end. It's absolutely conserved among all these different species. So glyphosate excessive use chronically disrupts the shikimate pathway and can affect photosynthesis and yield in citrus trees. And actually, Don Huber has talked a lot about the citrus trees in Florida suffering from a disease called citrus greening. And he has actually done studies with farmers who changed to organic farming and found that citrus greening disappeared. So I think glyphosate is a major factor in that problem that they're facing in the Florida oranges. And this paper is quite technical, and it goes into a lot of detail about the different effects, all of which are bad, that shows that the plants are unable to trap carbon, and they don't grow as well. They don't bear as much fruit. They have a low yield, and carbon dioxide assimilation goes down, which means that you're going to have more carbon dioxide in the air. Your fruit yields goes down. Shikimate accumulates in the plants, and so they showed this is the blue is where they the red is where they applied the glyphosate, and then the glyphosate distributed throughout the plant into the other leaves, and that's where it shows the blue translocated into the leaves. So here's a study on the effects of glyphosate on glyphosate sensitive and glyphosate resistant soybean plants. A really nice study. They looked at two different kinds of soybean, those that had the GMO that protected them, made the shikimate pathway perform correctly, and those that didn't. And both types of plants were affected, but in different ways. And so the sensitive plants, rapid inhibition of leaf photosynthesis, very, very important, because again, that's going to be trapping carbon. Glyphosate produced a rapid, marked, and sustained inhibition of photosynthetic carbon dioxide assimilation in the glyphosate-sensitive line. It's a quote from the paper. And then also it marked increase in glutathione synthesis, so it's an antioxidant defense. Glutathione is very important in both animals and plants as an antioxidant, and glyphosate induces oxidative stress. That's been shown in many papers that I've read. And so they have to increase the amount of glutathione in order to compensate, to try to soak up those active oxygen species. The resistant plants actually had a significantly reduced amount of chlorophyll compared to controls. And so they're also being affected by an inability to perform photosynthesis. And then they had accumulated high levels of glyphosate, very high levels of glyphosate in their leaves. And so any plant that's got leaves that you eat, that's glyphosate is going to go into those leaves, and we're going to be exposed. Increased pools of oxidized glutathione and ascorbate, both of which are antioxidant defenses. And then a very important point, rubisco expression was reduced by a factor of 25. I was very shocked when I saw that, because rubisco is the most common enzyme on the planet, and it plays an essential role in photosynthesis. So this is really going to be a hit hard on photosynthesis because of the reduction in the activity of rubisco. And rubisco is one of those proteins that has what I call a glyphosate susceptibility motif. So I would predict that rubisco would be affected by glyphosate. And now cloud seeding and marine phytoplankton. This is my last section. DMS, the climate gas you've never heard of, dimethyl sulfide, is a small sulfur-containing gas that plays a significant role in climate change. And as I said, this is something that I only learned recently. It's a fascinating molecule, dimethyl sulfide. Here's a picture of it. This is the sulfur, and then there's these two methyl groups attached to it. And you know about methylation pathways, so I suspect that it may be supplying both methyl groups and sulfur as a resource for microbes in the clouds, I'm suspecting. So it decreases the amount of solar radiation that reaches the Earth's surface by inducing cloud formation. So it makes clouds over the shallow seas. And it's synthesized from another molecule, which is a mouthful, dimethyl sulfoniopropanate, DMSP, by marine phytoplankton in shallow ocean waters. And there's a microbe in particular, Emiliania huxleyi, E. huxleyi, which is an important marine phytoplankton species that synthesizes this precursor. So it's going to be able to make that dimethyl sulfide. And so this particular species, I found an article that talks about glyphosate's effects on this species. And as I said, it produces this DMSP, and it exhibited severe growth inhibition when it was exposed to glyphosate. And they did it at two different levels, a low level 36 micromolar and a higher level 360 micromolar. And this is the plot that they got from their results. The white is the control. This is the lower level of glyphosate, and this is the higher level of glyphosate. So it completely kills these species at higher levels, and it also suppresses them at the lower levels of glyphosate. And so the suppression of the release of DMS from phytoplankton in shallow seas may have a significant impact on climate change through insufficient cloud formation over the oceans. So in summary, glyphosate is pervasive in our environment, and it is a significant contributor to human health issues and harm to the ecosystem. Glyphosate accumulates in biomass and harms water fleas. At the bottom of the food chain, chemical-based agriculture in Florida is leading to the toxic algae blooms and harm to the Florida manatees and other species. Glyphosate disturbs the nutrients in the soil, chelating minerals and interfering with nitrogen uptake and photosynthesis. Marine phytoplankton can see clouds, but glyphosate interferes with that process. And we urgently need to drastically reduce the use of glyphosate on crops. And this is the end of my talk.
Thank you so much, Dr. Seneff. I've got about 1 million questions. I will save them till the end when Dr. Talbot finishes his talk, and I'm sure others will have questions as well. So I hope you can hang around for a few minutes. Thank you so much.